I'll never forget, during one of my visits to the Sudbury Valley School, watching 4 or 5-year-old girls at a school meeting, akin to a New England town meeting, at which a trial of a student was being conducted. The young girls, 5 years old, were straining to read a long bill of particulars before casting their vote. It was clear by their intentness and their desire to participate in making the rules that govern their activities that they had a powerful motivation to learn how to read. And as a byproduct, their sense of personal responsibility, teamwork, shared decision-making, and citizenship would be enhanced. And as I say these words, there's something much richer than those comments, those words. Imagine how dangerous our world will become if we excel in teaching science and technology and are wildly successful at that, but students do not learn democracy and civic responsibility, which is necessary to make proper use of the technology. We would become a world of Dr. Strangeloves, capable of doing more harm to ourselves than good. I've been present at the school during the time when the school administrators and teachers are elected by the students and their salaries are set by the students. And it's amazing to observe Dan Greenberg nervously awaiting the results, even though as the founder, he is always reinstated by 97%. Dan Greenberg is a man totally devoted to principles of learning that are compatible with an idealized view of the human potential and freedom. His lifelong journey to create and operate a school of the future is truly courageous. He left his position as professor of physics at Columbia University to follow his dream and create a school that was aligned with modern cognitive science, but as important, aligned with principles of democracy and the social system that must evolve to cope with the rapid evolution of science and technology. He's a prolific writer, not because he seeks recognition, but because he's the most generous man I know, always willing to share his knowledge and wisdom about the learning process, which we all look forward to right now. Dan?
Thanks. Thank you, Mort. I'm going to give a presentation today which will be a little different from the ones that you've been hearing till now, and perhaps surprisingly to you, a little less high-tech. And what I'm going to try to do is go back to first principles and ask a few questions that I think ought to be asked and dealt with before we get on to the business of restructuring schools. And I'm going to start with a question that may seem a little silly, and that is, what is the purpose of schools in society? Why do we have schools? And I'm talking about the kinds of schools now that are universal, that is to say, schools that are aimed at the entire population and not just at a few specialists that have always been trained throughout history. Because as you all know, there haven't been schools throughout most of history. In fact, the world did very well, apparently, without public schools or without mass education until about 150 years ago, which is something to give us all pause as we sit here and consider how important our work is, that the human race somehow managed to evolve from its earliest origins to a rather advanced state of ethics and philosophy and literature and art and technology without the benefit of mass education. So you have to ask yourself, why do we have schools? Why do they exist? And I think the answer is rather simple. The purpose of schools in society are to provide an environment in which children can grow to be effective adults Now, that leads to the question of what it means to be an effective adult in society. And that, in turn, depends on the nature of the society and on the culture of the society. And there's really a wonderful, true story that reflects this. It's one of my favorite tales that I read many years ago in Benjamin Franklin's writings. And they put this question of the nature of society and the purpose of schools in society in wonderful perspective. Franklin tells the story of a meeting between the leaders of Virginia's political establishment, the state of Virginia, the colony of Virginia's political establishment, and a number of leaders of American Indian tribes. And the leaders of the Virginia political establishment were proposing something to the Native Americans. They said, we would like to take a dozen of your brightest and best young people and give them the privilege of a free education at Harvard College so that you'll be able to join in this great modern technological civilization that we're creating in America, in the colonies. And the leaders looked at him, the American Indian leaders looked back with amazement and said, we pass, thank you, because we've had this experience already. We sent 6 of our youngsters to Harvard College some years ago, and they came back utterly useless. They had no idea how to skin animals. They had no idea how to tan skins, how to build tents, how to build huts, how to make a fire. They were completely useless in our society. So we'll reverse the offer to you. Why don't you give us 12 of your best young men and send them to us for training, and we'll turn them into real men who will learn how to function in the Virginia surroundings. And I think that's a wonderful story because it pinpoints so carefully the relationship between what the purpose of a school is and what a culture is. And we can't forget that. We can't lose sight of that. It's totally critical to our understanding of learning in the 21st century. Let me talk about where we've come from and then where we're going to. In the last 3 centuries or so, we've been in what, for want of a better word, I'll call the industrial age society. And I want to talk about the nature of that society and its needs. And there are 3 aspects that I want to discuss, which are, to me, the central, the bottom line aspects of a culture and of its schools. The first is, what is the model of reality of that culture? How did that culture of the industrial age see reality? And we've already heard a good deal about this, so I won't have to spend too much time on it. It's that of a universe as a machine. Now, I want to say a few words about what that means, because I have a slightly different take on it. We're not talking here about a universe, in my opinion, of cause and effect. Cause and effect is something that's been talked about with great profundity since ancient times, and certainly since Aristotle wrote reams about it. But the concept of a machine, as Newton and Galileo and Descartes and others saw it, is a much more specific concept. It's a concept of an entity consisting of many parts, all of which are meshed together perfectly and work in a perfect, comprehensible order. They all work together. And once you can discover and uncover the laws governing that order, you have gained complete understanding of the universe. And that applies in that model not only to the workings of the planets and of the heavens, but applies to everything. It applies to every living thing, it applies to societies, and it applies to the human nature. So the ideal of the industrial age was to keep uncovering these rules and laws that give you that kind of knowledge and understanding of how everything that works in perfect harmony actually functions together. That's the model of reality. Now, within that model of reality, what is the second feature that I want to look at? What is the ideal of society? Within that model, what did people want as a society to attain? Which gives us some insight into what effective adulthood is. And the ideal of society during the industrial era, surprisingly enough, was stability. Because underlying the concept of understanding is the concept of stability. Once you understand everything, you can position yourself and everything in an orderly, stable whole. And what people were looking for was the order that gives you a good and stable society. The reasons for instability were lack of understanding. Knowledge would bring a better meshing and a better functioning of all the parts. And to have a stable understanding of the world was the goal of everybody. All the natural sciences worked on that. All the natural sciences worked to uncover immutable, perfectly comprehensible laws of nature. All the social sciences worked on it. And moral philosophers worked on it. If you read the moral philosophies of the 19th, 18th, 19th, and even much of the early 20th century, you'll find people focusing on finding those immutable, fundamental, ethical laws that should govern human society. And in fact, you can almost look at the 20th century as a century in which this quest on a social and governmental scale reached its peak. Because the quest for perfect order and perfect understanding led to experiment after experiment after experiment in country after country with forms of government that would perfectly coordinate and mesh all the parts. And if you look in a detached fashion at the history of socialism, communism, fascism, and even aspects of social democracy, you will find that the underlying principle, the underlying goal and hope of all of these social functions were to create an orderly society in which every part produces and consumes and relates in a way that fits peacefully and doesn't have friction between it. And in many ways, even though this was, excuse me, a catastrophic century, it was a century in which this ideal of the machine, of the perfectly meshed machine in all its parts, was pushed to its farthest extreme. Now let's see where that leaves you with schools. That depends on the third aspect of a culture, what the model of the human mind is. And within the mechanistic universe, the human mind also is a mechanism. And if you think of the progress of children and human beings as they're born, they start out with very little skills, very little knowledge, and then they develop into adults. What is going on here from a mechanistic point of view? What is going on is an organism, the brain, which initially starts out somehow, we're not quite sure how, but initially starts out relatively empty of whatever it is it needs, and has to be worked on and filled and given all the instruments and all the content that it has to have in order to function as an effective mini-machine within the universal machine. That makes perfect sense. And that's where the concept of universal schooling and the curriculum comes from. Because once you understand that the whole universe is a machine into which every single element fits, once you know and you think you've discovered how they fit, it's your duty to make sure that each piece of that machine gets inserted into its central control system, the brain, all the equipment it needs in order to function properly. And it makes perfect sense within that model. The idea of a curriculum, the idea of schools on which 20th century schooling was based makes perfect sense if you understand the concept of the universe, the ideal of the society and what is necessary to do to children in order to get their brains working within that picture. And I do have to take just a minute to show you something that I think virtually everybody in this room is aware of, but we seem to almost act during this conference as if it doesn't exist, as if we've gotten beyond it. These are the curriculum standards of the United States. There is a project in the United States that many of you know about called Project 2000, in which leading educators from all over the country came together to design national standards. This is all in the standards movement, right? National standards that every single child should attain and know in the United States of America as they grow up. And this is a compendium of that. This is not a textbook. This is a listing of content. Because, of course, as the 20th century went along, it was inevitable that more and more stuff had to be pushed into these little brains because more and more stuff was being known. And if your model is a mechanistic model, you're caught. You've got to do it. You owe it to the children. They need it. They can't possibly survive without it in this world that we're now increasingly understanding. Look at this. Let me just read you the subject headings, and I'll read you a few of the details just so you have a little amusement. This is real. This is going to every school system in the country. Standardized tests are being devised at every grade level for every child based on this book or its equivalent. Teacher salaries, principal salaries, school system funding based on this. The ultimate expression of the deterministic industrial age. Here are the categories. Every child, mind you, every child has to be knowledgeable in mathematics, science, history, language arts, the arts, civics, economics, foreign language, geography, health, physical education, technology, behavioral studies, and life skills. Who can argue with that? Sounds like a reasonable listing. Oh, I don't know. I picked out a few of these. I usually have fun just opening this book every now and then and just looking at it. Here, let's look at mathematics. And keep thinking of this in the context that every child in the country has to have this. Uses basic operations on vectors. For example, vector addition and scalar multiplication. I will not embarrass you. Uses properties of and relationships among figures to solve mathematical and real-world problems. For example, uses the property that the sum of the angles in a quadrilateral is equal to 360 degrees to square up the frame for a building. Uses understanding of arc, chord, tangents, and properties of circles to determine the radius given a circular edge of a circle without the center. Now, this is something we all do all the time. You all are confronted with an arc of a circle that you must find the radius of, or you cannot possibly function in the 20th century world. All right, let's just take another subject. I'm not going to take too long on this, but they're so wonderful. Every single child in the country should know the structures of different types of cell parts. For example, cell wall, cell membrane, cytoplasm, cell organelles such as the nucleus, chloroplast, mitochondrion, Golgi apparatus, vacuole, and the functions they perform. That is, transport of materials, storage of genetic information, photosynthesis and respiration, synthesis of new molecules, and waste disposal. This is just one item, people. That's just this little item. Do you all know all these things? I don't. But then again, I didn't get a good education. Mine was 50 years old. Now we're talking the end of the 20th century. How about history? Understands the social impact of the Second Great Awakening. How the second one, please. How Great Awakening leaders affected ordinary people. How the belief in individual responsibility for salvation and millennialism influenced reform movements, in the plural. The role of moral suasion, social control, and compromise in reform. Oh, this is so entertaining. Or let's look at some other world history. Every child in this country should understand the significant characteristics of early Chinese society and religion. For example, the influence of the natural environment on Huanghe civilization compared to its impact on Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley. Early Chinese urban societies and how they compare to those of Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley, and the nature of Shang ancestor worship and what it illustrates about concepts of life and death in Shang society. How many of you would like to take a standardized test right now based on this? I will not go on. Because the point is that this is not the work of frivolous people or foolish people. This is the work of people who are honest and sincere in trying to make sure that every child becomes an effective adult in society when their concept of the world is mechanistic and their concept of society is that of a machine in which all the parts have to fit and mesh beautifully, and their concept of the brain is that of a mechanism which has to have storage put into it to function in this. This is the logical consequence of it. And we entered the 21st century, we in America, with this as our guideline. So I'll just put this here for one moment so that you can see that that's sort of, industrial society. And this doesn't quite show it all. And the model of the human mind as fillable and tradable. Let's look now at post-industrial society, which is the society that we're in, the society that we started to enter in the last half of the 20th century, that we're well into now. And actually, we started to enter it a little earlier. And let me start with the following question. What is the model of reality of post-industrial society? And this is really sort of a stunner for those of us like me who were brought up in another age. The model of reality is that of chaos. It's that of randomness. It's that of uncertainty. It's a model in which nothing has a fixed place. Nothing meshes perfectly with anything else because the concept of perfect meshing doesn't exist. And I'd like to take just a couple of minutes to show you how this transition happened. Because most people think it happened rather abruptly. You heard some mention of it yesterday with the birth of modern physics and quantum mechanics and all these things. You hear about Heisenberg principle and all these things. But let me tell you, that's not how it actually started. It actually started towards the end of the 19th century. That's how early it started. When people were posed with the following, physicists, and the rest of the world didn't know about this. The rest of the world was still running along with its mechanistic model. And physicists were struggling with a problem of how do I tell how a gas operates? This is one archetypal problem. This a gas, like the air in this room. How can I tell anything about the air in this room or its properties? It's got just zillions of molecules running around. Now, I know that the world is deterministic. And I know, this is back in the 19th century, right? That if I knew where every single molecule was and how it was moving and exactly what its nature was, and I ground this out into some huge calculator, I know that my laws of physics would tell me exactly how air would operate in this room. But I don't know that. And the physicists in the 19th century knew they didn't know it. So they said, does that mean we can't ever do any real physics? Does that mean that we're stuck with just doing the physics of idealized things? No, we want to know how gases operate. We want to know something about them. So they invented certain physicists invented what's called statistical mechanics. And statistical mechanics is an esoteric arm of physics in which the assumption is randomness and chaos. And you start with the assumption that you got all these molecules, and they're moving around, they're all chaotic, and gee, what would happen if that was the case? And lo and behold, they got all kinds of wonderful laws of nature, how gases operate and how this operates. And they applied it to metals and they applied it to gases and all kinds of things. And it was its own separate branch. And if you read the literature of physics in the early part of the 20th century, you see this heart-wrenching anguish that physicists undergo between this wonderful result that they're getting by assuming things are chaotic and their belief that everything is determined. And they're trying to say, why does random statistics work when the world is so determined? But that's a little esoteric debate that took part just in one little corner of physics. And then the walls kept breaking down, and the walls kept breaking down, and then all these other things you heard about came in. And by the end of the 20th century, with quantum theory and Heisenberg and indeterminacy and all the rest, the whole structure of determinism broke down, and a completely different picture of the universe. Now, what's the ideal of society in this case? Remember, the old ideal was stability. That doesn't work anymore. In fact, the ideal of society now in the post-industrial age is adaptability to change. The key concept now in a world in which there's chaos is how to adapt to change. There's no longer the remotest hope of discovering stability. There's no longer the remotest hope of finding out how everything meshes and how everything fits. There's no such thing in our new model of reality. Everything is change. In fact, those of you who are acquainted with pre-Socratic philosophy will probably say, aha, I remember hearing that. And Heraclitus, who said, all is change. The river that you step into today is not the same river you stepped into yesterday. So it's not a completely new concept. You have to adapt now to a world of change. That's what all of society is about. And what's really interesting is we, all of us in this room, and I mean every single person, possible exception maybe of some of the Arthur Anderson Learning Center students, but I won't even guarantee that. We are still the transition generation. We were brought up with one model. We're not really comfortable. As it was said yesterday, it's not in our gut, this other model, but it's in the gut of young children. It's in their gut. Anybody who works with children who are under the age of 12 sees it. It's in their gut. Their world is a world of rapid change, of rapid transformation. And that's something they inherently understand. We're struggling with it. We understand it up here, but our insides say, but we have to make sure that this happens. We have to make sure that that happens. Part of the adaptability to change has to do with decentralization. Remember I talked about the 20th century being the century of organizations, of organized politics? Well, the 21st century is the century of decentralization. And of course, it's a trend that we all see in all of our politics and in all of the governmental things that are going on all around the world. There is no longer the ability, it's realized, to make all of society work together. The only way to work is through a decentralization and democratization of society. This is true in politics, and as you've heard over and over again, it's true of business, and as you'll see, it's true of education as well. The concept of democracy is embedded in the concept of chaos and change. There's no other form of interaction but a democratic interaction. Okay, let's look at the model of the mind that goes with this. And the model of the mind that we have today is completely different and fits this perfectly. It's the model of the curious seeker. The mind is an active, curious agent acting on the world and creating models of reality for itself all the time. A child is a self-starting learner. This is a completely different model. It's the same child, it's the same people, and it's the same people looking at children. But today, instead of seeing children whose minds have to be filled, we see children who are eagerly pursuing knowledge, eagerly building pictures of the world, eagerly trying to learn what their environment is about and to make pictures of that environment. And that's the key. Every single one of us creates models of reality. This is a key that we have to understand. All of us individually are creating models of reality all the time. That's what being all this talk about a lifelong learner, that's what it's about. Being a lifelong learner is recognizing that the mind, as long as you're alive, is searching for meaning, searching for making a worldview, searching for making a meaningful, comprehensible model of our reality. You do it every single minute of your living day, and most of the night too. This is an active thing. It's biological. It's ingrained in our new model of reality. It's the way the human race survived. The human race could only survive by having children eagerly want to learn about the world. Think about it. Think about that million years before 1830s and 1840s and 1850s when you didn't have mass education. How did anything ever happen? How did children ever become effective adults except by searching, by learning about their environment, by finding out about what's going on around them? So this is a crucial understanding now, shift of understanding of how the mind works. And it's the opposite of the curriculum. It's the opposite of the idea, the diametric opposite of the idea that stuff has to be pushed into a brain that's a receptacle. It's the idea that the brain has to be allowed to explore the world on its own and to create its own models of reality. So again, just for quick review, if we can get this, post-industrial society in the 21st century has a model of reality as uncertainty, chaos, statistics. The ideal of society is adaptability to change, and the model of the mind is that of a curious modeler and a self-starting learner. So now the question is, having this new reality, what is needed to be an effective adult in the 21st century? And this is the low-tech part. This is the low-tech part, because the answer to the question is a low-tech answer. Let's look at this in light of what we've been talking about, step by step. And I'm going to point out three things. And one of the things I hate about numbers is that the minute you say something, then they all say 3, 4. I don't mean that there aren't 4, there aren't 5. Poor Howard Gardner had, what, 7 intelligences? And now there's 7 intelligences, you know? And if somebody comes up with, God forbid, an 8th, then they think that Gardner's going to have a fit. But let me pick out 3 that I think are crucial within this framework. First thing you need to be an effective adult in society is to be a good problem solver and model builder. Okay? You've got chaos. The only way to handle chaos is to make order out of it. That's how we survive. We cannot live in chaos. That's what our brain is about in this model. So we've got to become good model builders. We've got to let people build models and solve problems, which is part of what building models is about. Well, how do you do that? How do you make model builders and problem solvers? Well, you see, the thing is that nature did it for us. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here today sitting in this Arthur Anderson Learning Center after 1 million years. Nature built it into us. It gave us the instrument of play. Play is the essential learning instrument for model building and problem solving. And it is something that every child and every human being is given as a birthright. What is play? Play is any activity that doesn't have a known outcome. That's all it is. The minute it has a known outcome, it's not play. You take a piece of wood and you say, I'm going to make a bookend out of this, and you make a bookend out of it, you have not been playing with that piece of wood. You've been making a bookend out of it. You take a piece of wood and say, I wonder what will happen if I start carving this, and your name is Michelangelo, and that's play. And then all of a sudden you have a nice sculpture. If the outcome is known, it's not play. But virtually all of the important activities of life have an unknown outcome. When we wake up in the morning, we don't even know how the day is going to unfold. We may have a schedule and a book and a plan, but in this world of change and chaos, you don't know what's going to happen the next minute. You have to be really good to function in this world, to constantly deal with unknown outcomes. And look at how bad so many of us are. So many of us are so neurotic about it, me included, you know. I would love my day to be orderly. That's how I was brought up. I would love not to have somebody disrupt my schedule, because that's how I was taught. But that's a handicap. That's a handicap because I was told that I have to put aside childish things, right? When I grew up and matured, and become serious about life. I have to tell you a little anecdote about this that I completely missed the significance of when it happened. And I only understood many, many years later. When I was a graduate student, one of my professors, Robert Serber, was a very, very famous physicist who was highly instrumental in developing the atomic bomb and a brilliant theoretician and a very humble guy, a very sweet and humble guy. And this was back in the middle 50s. And I worked for him one summer as an assistant. And I said to him, I see you've got a National Science Foundation grant for this summer to work. He said, yeah. It's a big grant, I said, which it was back then, thousands and thousands of dollars. He said, yeah. I said, well, what do you plan to do? He said, I plan to sail on my yacht. I said, for the whole summer? He said, yeah. And that was the whole conversation. And I remember thinking, this is perfect 20th versus 21st century. Robert Serber, who never saw the 21st century, was a 21st century man. And the people who funded him had enough brains to understand it. And later on, when we talked about it, I began to see it. The National Science Foundation back then understood that the only way to get creative work out of this man was to let him play. And he articulated it many years later. When I'm on my yacht, I'm completely free of any thoughts, of any plans, of any programs. I'm just enjoying sailing, and that's when my mind clears out and new thoughts come into it. And I, at the time, with all of my peers and with congressmen who are always looking for the prize, you know, the Proxmire Prize for waste of money, are always saying, look at this, somebody gave somebody thousands of dollars to sail on a yacht. Play is essential, and children do it naturally. Now, we see that in 1-year-olds, we see it in 2-year-olds, we see it in 3-year-olds. They're always playing, and they're always creating games, and they're always creating tremendously imaginative games. You don't have to give them learning games. You don't have to give them games with known outcomes. You don't have to give them games with things that are supposed to be put together this way in order to form a word. Just let them play. They can play with sticks and stones as well as they can play with the most advanced and expensive Lego blocks. And the outcome is just as good. They become superb problem solvers. They learn how to build models of reality. And as they grow up, if you don't stop them, if you let them continue to play, they retain that ability throughout their lives. And talk about transferability. If you can play, you can do anything. And you all know that. You see, the problem with so much of this is we all know it. When we read the biographies of great, great minds that we all admire, what do we see about all of them? They walked in the woods, they took time, they played the violin like Einstein, they had all kinds of crazy things that they did. They didn't spend that much time working and doing productive things with known outcomes. The people we admire most played. But we don't want to take that lesson. You know why? Because we've been told that we're not that smart. We're drones. That's for Einsteins, and I hear that so many times. Oh, that idea is good for geniuses, for creative people. My son is just an ordinary kid. There's no such thing as an ordinary human being. Every human being is born with the ability to build models and be creative. You cannot distinguish in a group of 1-year-olds and 2-year-olds playing around on the floor. Nobody, I will guarantee this, that there's nobody in the world who could point to one or another and say, this one is going to be creative, this one is going to be an ordinary drone. Because they're all creative at that time. And we have to let that continue. So, step number 1, what is needed to be an effective adult? Being a good model builder, knowing how to play. If you know how to play, this is totally and completely transferable. If you can play with clay and with stones, you can play with programs. You can play with computers. You can play with metals. You can play with chemicals. You can play with figures. You can play with anything if you know how to play, because you've learned how to build models and how to create order out of chaos. That's what play is about. Let's look at a second thing that you need to be an effective adult in the 21st century with this new model of reality. You need communication skills. Now let me explain why you need communication skills, because this is something that, again, is looked at in a very peculiar way. Did you ever ask yourselves a simple question? Why do children learn how to talk? Why do children learn how to talk? It's actually a very interesting question, because if you read accounts of speech, of the function of human speech, in anthropology books and sociology books, what do people usually say about speech? People usually say that man's ability to communicate is important because it enables the human race to do things jointly, to do things together that they couldn't do individually. It makes people able to form organizations for certain ends. So, for example, you couldn't build a bridge alone, but now that you can talk to other people and you can communicate with each other, you can all get together and build a bridge or build a road or have an army and win a war and all this stuff. There's only one problem with this. A child, when he or she is 1 year old, isn't thinking about building bridges or armies. They have no concept that when they grow up, they're going to do things together with other people, like sit in conferences. But they're dying to learn how to talk. Why? Why do they do this, which is the single most demanding job that any human being ever does in his entire life? You have done nothing in your lives from the day you were born till now, and you never will, that's harder than the task of learning how to talk. No question about it. And what you see it if you observe any child learning how to talk. They take a span of years to do it. They struggle at it all the time. They fail at it all the time. They come back and try again. Failure means nothing to children because they're determined. It doesn't mean anything in play, and it doesn't mean anything in learning how to speak. Why are they so hell-bent for leather to learn how to speak? What is it that they sense about it that makes them feel it's so essential? And the answer to that is actually rather simple if you look at children and if you actually watch them learning how to speak. Because in their own nonverbal and intuitive way, they grasp that speech gives them a window into your persona, into your mind. They understand that by communicating with you orally, and hearing what you have to say and saying back to you, they are getting an understanding of the world that goes beyond what they get in their own way by playing, but which includes understanding what you understand and what you want. They realize that speech is a tool to connect them to other models of reality. Now, of course, they don't realize it in those words, but they realize it intuitively. They want to know what you know. And the reason they want to know what you know and what everybody else knows is because that gives them a tremendous new tool in their model building and in their understanding of the world. That means, literally, that every child doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. That means, literally, that potentially every single child has access to the entire range of human knowledge. That's what talk is about. And that's why it's so precious, because it is the key. It is the key for each child to get into everybody else's brain and world model, and thereby improve their own understanding of the world. What a tremendous tool. People have to talk a lot in order to learn a lot. Now, this is sort of interesting about this, that we don't get it often. You know, lots of people have teenage kids, and I see this all the time. Lots of people have teenage kids, and the teenage kids are on the phone for hours. And it annoys them terribly. Why are you on the phone for hours? And what are you talking about? What on earth are they talking about? Can you imagine somebody's on the phone for 3 hours, they're talking about what they're going to wear to the prom. And there isn't a single one of us 20th century conditioned people who don't say, this is a monumental waste of time, not to mention my phone bill. Right? But why are they you see, you're asking the wrong question. Why is my teenager doing this? I mean, I know my teenager, I mean, I shouldn't say this, but most teenagers, if you look at them objectively, the other guy's teenagers aren't slackers. Most of us think ours are, but the others aren't. Why are they doing this? What are they getting out of 3 hours of talking about what to wear at the prom? Now, I don't have a complete answer to that, but I know one thing. I know they're getting something very important. They're getting something very important about dressing, about what clothes mean in a certain environment, about how other people see what clothes mean in a certain environment, about how the clothes that they wear and how it's put together reflects their personality in other people's eyes, a whole gamut of things. That's what they're searching for. And this is an important part of their model building at that moment, because it's important to them to know at that moment how they are going to fit into a certain social environment in which they're going to be placed. Now, that's a transferable skill. You want them to have that skill, because that very same skill is the skill that enables them to sit down at another time and talk for 4 hours with a bunch of software engineers about how they're going to write their next program. Or sit with a bunch of, I don't know, philosophers and try to figure out what the meaning of life is. It's the same thing. Conversation is central to building models of reality that are effective, and it's completely transferable. And it's something every kid does naturally. So, item number 2, you have to be a good information processor through conversation and communication and interpersonal skills. And now for number 3. The third thing you need, in addition to being able to play and to talk, and this is really very important, is a sense of empowerment, a sense of confidence. See, if you play and build models, think about it. You play and you create a model, your child, and then along comes somebody and says, that model stinks. Okay? You start playing on an instrument, you say, gee, it's nice, I'm going to pick up this flute or recorder and I'm going to start playing things with my recorder. And some adult music teacher comes along and says, you suck. You cannot play worth a damn. What does that do to that person's interest in continuing to play and explore? It's very negatively, it has a very negative effect on it, to put it mildly, right? It's something that destroys their confidence in their own ability to play and converse and build models of reality and make a life for themselves. The only way people can be productive in this new model, can actually be problem solvers, can actually be people who create models of reality and who are creative, is if they believe in themselves that they can do it. If they don't think they can do it, they won't. If they think they can do it, they will, because they've got the tools. They know how to play. They know how to talk. They've got to feel that they can. And again, I come back to that parent that I talked to you about earlier. The parent who comes to us and says, my child is just ordinary. And the child sits there and listens to that. And that is the judgment of his own parent. You have no substance, no power. Empowerment is the key third item that enables you to be an effective adult in the 21st century. Now, empowerment implies it is a democratic environment. That's what democracy is about. See, democracy isn't about the old Athenian form, which is the rule of the majority. That's a little piece of democracy. That's a decision-making process. The essence of democracy, as the modern world understands it, is that of individual rights, is that of a group of people who are all respected as individuals. That's the essence of democracy. Democracy starts with the belief that all people are created equal and that they all have equal standing in society. And I don't care if you're religious, equal standing before the Lord, whatever, but equal standing. That no person is inherently superior in any way, shape, or form to any other person. How you make decisions, that's secondary. Some people like consensus, some people like majority votes, some people want 4/5. That's not important. You'll always find a way to make decisions when people don't agree. But the essence is to agree to disagree, which means to agree that every single person is a person in his or her own right and fully entitled to realize their full potential. That's what democracy is about. Now, that's what kids feel when they're born. That's what kids feel when they're small. I mean, the only lack of feeling of equality between kids is usually between siblings, because the older one usually beats the younger one up, until the younger one says, someday I'm going to be big enough and beat you up. But fundamentally, kids don't distinguish between each other when they're 1 and 2 years old. It's we who make the distinctions. And the key to being an effective adult in the 21st century is to understand and experience and feel full empowerment, full equality. You know, we've struggled in this country to reach that point, and much of the world has struggled to reach this point, and by now most of the world is pretty much getting there. You know, we went through a situation where first the only people who are even though we have in our Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, of course it meant men, we didn't really believe it. You know we didn't believe it. We had slaves. But it stood there, and it took time for people of color to be included in this concept in this country. It took a tremendous battle for women to be accepted. And now I want to show you something. Just put this in the back of your mind. You know what the biggest argument was against accepting women as equal to men? Do you know what people said more than anything else if you read the anti-suffrage literature back then? Why we should not give women the vote? Because women are like children. That's what they said. Women are like children. And you know what's wrong with children. They're changeable. They can't make up their minds. They don't have good judgment. Women are like children. And with great fear and trembling, we gave the vote to women. And the country didn't fall apart. It's a miracle. But we forgot that we said women are like children. Because you should think about that. Reverse it. How about saying children are like women? Or people? How do we know that children don't have the same ability to make decisions and for themselves and for their community as well as adults? How do we know that? Where has it been really put to the test? The essential to being an effective adult in the 21st century is to be in a democratic environment. Let's look at these three. I'd like to look at these now a little carefully. We talk about play, conversation, and a democratic environment as the three essential components, three essential factors that are needed to be an effective adult in the 21st century. That's a rather interesting list because it contains almost everything that 20th century schools don't have, right? It's the diametric opposite, just like the model of reality. Now, that shouldn't surprise us, because the model of reality is the diametric opposite. Perfect order, perfect chaos. Now, look, we don't do any of this in our schools, and we shouldn't if we have a 20th century model of reality. We don't let kids play. We're even cutting out recesses in the United States because we want to add more courses, more days, summer, night, weekends, holidays, extra tutoring. Play? No way. And even our play has become mechanized in so many ways. Not only do we have these blasted educational games everywhere that are imposed on children so that a kid hardly ever sees a stick or a stone. You know, even when they go to the seashore, they're hardly allowed to play with sand anymore. They've got all these construction equipment that give you the right form of sand if you wet them and put them down. Nobody plays. We tell them they shouldn't play. Stop playing around. Work. You can go to play after you've done your homework. Conversation. You're not allowed to open your mouth in a school, except to answer a teacher's question. You two stop talking over there. Go to the principal's office. You're not allowed to talk. Kids never talk to each other in school except in the halls. And then they're rushing from one class to another. It's absolutely mind-boggling. You cannot have conversations in schools, real ones. And even in modern progressive schools with new paradigms, what do they talk about? They talk about the projects that their teachers want them to talk about. Let's not kid ourselves. You know, let's not paint things in a different color. When we talk about interdisciplinary or project learning or all this stuff, what are we really talking about? We're talking a different form of curriculum, a different agenda that some facilitator is giving them to talk about. We're not really sitting and saying, what do you want to talk about? What do you care about? And our schools are the most undemocratic institutions that exist. How on earth can anybody in any country expect to have an effective, adult, empowered democracy when for 12 or more years their children are sitting in their formative ages in a pure autocracy that is the equal of any absolute monarchy of the Middle Ages? They have no rights. The U.S. Constitution gives them no rights. The U.S. Supreme Court gives them no rights. They can be pushed around and told what to do by adults without accountability. It's mind-blowing. This is the year 2000. Nobody else can be treated that way, and nowhere. So that's my low-tech presentation. My low-tech presentation is that schools in the 21st century, if they're going to be effective, if they're going to prepare adults who are effective adults, have to be an environment in which children are allowed free rein to play, free rein to converse about what they want to converse about, and be in an environment where they are democratic, fully empowered democratic participants in the community of the school. Now, if we create schools like that, we create schools that are compatible with our new understanding of reality. People who come out of schools like that will be adaptable to change, will be self-confident, will know how to seek information, will know how to find what they have to find, will know how to communicate. I have before I end, I have an interesting quote here, which really caught my eye in that lovely, very conservative journal, The Economist. And they have their little columns in The Economist in which they talk about economics focus. And they talk about what we need. This is sort of relevant to the needs of modern society. Front office workers with people skills and good managers are the main winners from the information technology revolution. Interorganizational networking involving the automation of company bureaucracies could in the future be as fruitful as the earlier phases of large-scale automation. The amount of mid-skill white-collar work in buying and selling is stunning. Thanks to computers, oddly enough, the ability to get on well with other people is going to be even more valuable in the future than it has been up till now. These are transferable skills. They're skills that you can use in any business. They're skills that you can use in any setting if you've honed them and been allowed to develop them throughout childhood. That's a 21st century learning institution. And the people who walk out of that are always lifelong learners. They're adults who haven't forgotten how to play. They're adults who know how to communicate with other people and relate to them and find out information or whatever they need, their wisdom and whatever they need from them. And they're fully empowered citizens of a modern society. Thank you. If you want, we can
Stay up here. You know, one thing that occurred to me, I was just listening to you, Dan, which was a wonderful presentation. You know, we hear what has almost there's so many new phrases that categorize, you know, the new learning model. And one of them you hear is, you know, teachers as learners. And some of these things become trite until when you come up against the reality. You know, Dan is part of an environment where the teachers learn just how rich a mind and knowledge from hanging out with four-year-olds and five-year-olds for the last 30-some-odd years. I think the kids ought to vote you a bonus this year. I think we ought to take 5 minutes at your tables and just have a dialogue amongst yourselves to kind of digest this. And then I'll call your attention back here. Okay, I'd like to ask you to bring your conversations to a close. I hate to terminate conversation, but only for the purpose of reigniting it. If you try to move towards once they...
Send them to the principal's office.
And do we have some... I want to remind you before that there will be a couple of more breakout sessions with the Sudbury Valley School, so this dialogue can continue with Dan. But why don't we start the process right now over the next 15 minutes or so for some questions for Dan.
Once she's going to be bringing it.
In talking about the model of the world as chaos, doesn't religion and education, isn't the job of religion and education to provide the illusion of stability in the midst of chaos? And then that's the first question. The second thing is, in talking about the way you're educating the kids at Sudbury, it sounds very much like Summerhill. And the research that I've read on Summerhill suggests that they all came out very well-adjusted kids, but none of them did anything exceptional with regard to creativity or anything else. They were all very well-adjusted.
First of all, I'm going to beg out of religion. As far as the task of education being to provide stability, we can agree to disagree. I don't think that it's the task in the modern world that I believe in. I don't think it's my task to determine your outcome. I think your outcome is something that you have a right to determine. I may have a picture of stability, and if you're interested in it, I'll be more than happy to share it with you. But it's your choice. I don't think it's my duty to impose my worldview of what I think stability is, because obviously everybody thinks it's something else. Otherwise, we'd all be living exactly like each other. So my answer to your first question is no. I don't think that's the task of education. I don't want to get into, I'd prefer to delay talking about such specifics as comparing our school to Summerhill to a breakout session, but I do want to say something about this without hopefully hurting anybody's feelings, certainly not Zoe Neal, who's A.S. Neal's daughter and is running it today. But Summerhill is not, in fact, a fully empowered democratic society, and they also maintain, because of rules that have been imposed upon them by outsiders, they maintain a steady presentation of the curriculum, which they allow their children not to go to. And that's a very, very fundamentally different atmosphere than an atmosphere in which children are, from the beginning, told, you set the tone, and you participate fully in running the show. But if that sounds like I'm putting Summerhill down, I have to say Summerhill has been, I think, a beacon of inspiration for ideas, for interesting ideas, to many, 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 many different kinds of educational innovators who have, looked at it and taken different parts of it. And it was the first. It was the first. And as Drew Levy said, the first guys, don't know what they're doing. And in many ways, it took us a long time to figure out what we're doing, too. I just can't favor one side of the room. You want to bring it to this lady?
I want to thank you for bringing up the compendium of knowledge that so many of us are faced with in education. How do you balance all of the outcomes today in our outcomes-driven public education movement with the type of play that you're talking about? Because I'm glad that you reaffirmed the need to play, and yet public schools have to find a way to do both of that. And plus, as our table was discussing, that compendium of knowledge has a great deal of culture that we hope would be passed on to students. And so do you have suggestions for a way that we can deal with the culture that we have learned and the way to play and achieve the outcomes that we need and still not stunt the creativity of students?
Okay, well, let me take outcomes first. I'm very sympathetic to public education's feeling that it needs these outcomes. It's an obsolete concept. The specification of outcomes, let me put it this way. Let me give you another analogy. When I was growing up, you could write the Bureau of Labor Statistics in Washington, and you could get a listing of all the job categories that exist in the United States. It was a booklet, because they kept that. Literally every pipe fitter, this, that, and everything else. I'm sure they still print one, but a few years ago, if you looked at something like that, it was, you couldn't even imagine it. In other words, the kinds of activities today that people can do to lead a productive life and to support themselves cannot be listed anymore. And therefore, a listing of outcomes, which is what the public school system, or I prefer to say industrial age education, is still stuck to, is still in that old picture that we know all the pieces and we want them all to mesh together. We don't know the pieces. There are no pieces. There are no pieces. And this is why I say younger people, all of this thing that's going on with .coms, that everybody talks about .coms, and of course everybody's so excited that NASDAQ fell, so the .coms are on their way out, yay, we don't have to worry about them anymore. That's nonsense, What are all these .coms about? And there are going to be zillions of them. And of course some are going to fail and some are going to succeed. They're all about people realizing that if you have an idea today, any idea, you can try to sell it to somebody else. You have the ability now to connect with the globe. And that's something you never had before. And that's why these outcomes are an absurdly outdated limiting factor. Now, your second question was, wait, refresh my memory.
First was the balance of the outcomes with, and then the second part was the culture that's
the culture. That's a
included in the
really
compendium.
important one. I want to say a word about that, because it's something that I've thought a lot about. And I have to say that I've been a historian for years. And as a historian, one of the things that most fascinates me is the rise and fall of cultures. And I read a book not too long ago. I don't know how many of you, maybe the Southeast, people from Southeast Asia are acquainted with this. I don't know how many of you are acquainted with the old hydraulic civilization that was spread throughout Indonesia and a lot of the southern continent. This is like 7,000 years old. Archaeological evidence of this civilization is vast. And it's called the hydraulic civilization. We don't know anything about it because it didn't have a writing system, and if it did, we wouldn't know what it said anyway. But what they did was they had these tremendously intricate constructions of waterways, dams, aqueducts, pipes, round pipes, all made out of stone, all fitted without mortar, waterproof. Okay? They actually have dug this up. They've dug up actually long, long pieces of underground piping that has a pitch, so the water will flow, a pitch of some, I don't remember the exact, but some remarkably slow pitch, even slower than that of the Roman aqueducts, which is remarkable enough. These are all incredibly intricate things. And I love that. I love that book because I kept thinking about this civilization. I just kept putting myself back there and thinking how grand they must have felt. They must have felt so advanced. They were. I mean, can you imagine those people back then? They're sitting there looking at these constructions, building these magnificent things, and where is it? Where is it? Cultures do not survive by the older people ramming it down the throats of the younger people. Cultures survive over the long run, by the younger generation recognizing of its own volition the value that the culture has. If you really believe, as I do, that this culture that we have here in the United States, and if anybody in another country believes the same about their culture, if you really believe this culture has value, lasting value, then you have to trust that intelligent, open-minded young people who will be immersed in it and engaged with it will see value in it too. That's the only way a culture will survive. There's no other way. And the detritus of grand historic cultures proves that that's the case. Because every one of them tried to maintain themselves by forcing it down the next generation's throats. Oh, okay, never mind, sorry.
That individual.
I was listening to your comments regarding play and conversation and empowerment for children, but I had thought that we don't allow any school administrators, people in the workplace, to play, to converse, nor do we give them empowerment. Could you comment a little bit about how do we give it to children if we aren't doing it in the education workplace to begin with? And just a personal comment, I want to thank you. I got a revelation from you. I can now rationalize that my golf game really is play because it has no known outcome.
Good. I think Mort will be thrilled with that last part. I spend a lot of time speaking to groups of teachers, administrators, and also to students in teachers' colleges. And I do it with a tremendous amount of sadness. I mean this quite literally. I do it with a tremendous amount of sadness. The only analogy that I can draw on for myself is as if I was some kind of a person talking to a group of horse carriage makers, in the year 1905. I mean, here's all these companies all over the country making horse carriages because that's the way people got around, right? Beautiful ones, big ones, new ones. And what do you tell them if you happen to have an in that the automobile is going to render them all obsolete within a very few number of years? How do you say that to people? How do you say to people who are filling jobs that are no longer compatible with the 21st century view of reality, that you got to find something else to do. Now, you know, it's very interesting. That sounds harsh, and it makes me sad. But I will tell you something that I've seen up in the Boston area, which is where we're from, at firsthand. We have gone through one after another massive wave of cutbacks in the large computer companies. Digital, which basically eliminated itself, Raytheon, Polaroid, one after another, laid off thousands and thousands of workers. And these layoffs started in the late 80s and the early 90s. And the initial response to that, and this is very similar to what we're talking about. We're talking about thousands of highly, highly trained people who had the benefits of the most advanced industrial age schooling. And the first reactions of those people was abject misery. And we lived that up there. You know, we were surrounded by engineers and managers and so forth who were deeply depressed because they had been prepared for something, and they did it well. They did the wrong thing right, okay? But the interesting thing that happened is the resilience of human nature. One after another of these people restructured their lives. I would say an incredible percentage of them went independent and became consultants. I mean, an unbelievable number, maybe as much as a quarter. And the others joined up and formed various kinds of startup companies and partnerships. There is no unemployment now in that region, none. And there hasn't been for at least 5 years. That means that tens of thousands of highly trained, industrial age trained people had to go through this conversion. I mean, it was a terrible conversion. Now, the kids who come out of a 21st century school, they'll be able to make that transition easily. Hey, this game is over. Let's find the next game in town. You know, people like school administrators and people like that who are sooner or later going to find themselves without a job because industrial schools will disappear. And you see it happening anyway, everywhere, with cyber learning and with the things that we hear about in the breakout sessions that are going on in the United Kingdom and the Netherlands, and I'm sure elsewhere. She is.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you because the message that you brought, I think, is the reality for the 21st century, and we're dealing with constituents, both teaching staff and public, that have not yet come to realize that's the reality. My question is, how do we reconcile this, those of us in public education who do not have our own private school that we can just take the philosophy that we might have and begin to implement it because our clientele has the option of choosing to come or not come. How do we reconcile this with the statewide assessments that are requiring us to stick to a standards-based curriculum, even though we know that this is an outdated model for the future? What advice would you have for us?
You're asking, I don't, because you're asking what, in my view, is a personal, ethical question. I'm sorry, I can't put a prettier face on it. It's a personal, ethical question. I'm stuck doing something. I had to face that question. That's why I'm not in academia anymore. You know, my brother stayed in academia. I didn't. You have to face a personal question. And it's not even a cost-benefit analysis. It's an ethical question.
We're still going to deal with, even if those of us who truly don't believe in what's happening now or believe that we have to change what's happening now, if we all abandoned the public system, we'd have a greater problem. So I think we have to stay and fight through some of that.
Let me just say, I have nothing against you staying and fighting. I don't have advice. You ask what's my advice. My answer is I don't have advice. It's a personal, ethical question. But I do want to say something. Back in the 70s and the 80s, my father, who was born in 1900 and died a few years ago, who saw the communist revolutions and the Russian Revolution, would tell me over and over again that the Bolshevik government in the former Soviet Union is an example of a regime that has so firmly established and entrenched itself using whatever methods it uses that it's not even conceivable that it will come to an end. Okay? Now, my father was an extremely intelligent, well-read person, you know, and he reached this conclusion based on a lot of thought. There is no way that anyone can predict or understand how an obsolete system comes apart. Nobody's learned how to do that, okay? Nobody in 1988 could have predicted or did predict what happened in 1989. And you saw there a continental system disintegrate. So, and I can give you many other examples like that. So I don't know the answer to that. You know, we have seen here industry after industry disintegrate, right? I mean, industry after industry. When I grew up, one of the major industries was the railroads. Pennsylvania Railroad, Penn Central, all these things. You know what their greatest asset was 10 years later? The land that they had been granted for their rights of way, because it all went through the hearts of cities. The railroads weren't worth anything. They were all sold off. I don't know the answer to that. Nobody could have told you. In 1945, we used to love it. We went from Philadelphia to San Francisco 3 days, 2 nights with an overnighter. What a trip. Tell us that a few years later it'll be, you know, a few hours on a plane?
Well,
I can't answer that question.
I think those of us who are here because we want to be change agents, and we realize
That's why we're
that
here.
change has to happen. So maybe through our networking
right.
and talking together,
That's
we'll
right.
come up with a greater
That's
answer.
right.
Thank you.
I think with that threshold question, it would be a good time to bring this segment to a close. Thank you very much, Dan, for a wonderful presentation.